Adobe stock is up plus 5% today, but is down minus 50% from its all-time high. I made a photograph of mine, and today in this video, we are going to deep dive into Adobe to see if it is an AI loser or if it's going to actually survive this new AI wave. So let's get started. Adobe doesn't need any introduction anymore. I think that most people are familiar at the surface level what is Adobe business, but I think it's very good to actually look back at how Adobe wants to present its business today and what is actually their core business model. So I think that a lot of people know that Adobe actually switched from the license model a decade ago to actually the cloud and subscription model. And so that's actually like their core business model today, delivering a suite of software from the cloud. And basically, so their core customers, and I think that this is pretty well summarized in their slides, is actually coming from first business professionals and amateur creators, then also creators and creative professionals, so people who do that as their main job, and also like marketing professionals. Actually, historically, so Adobe separated like digital media and digital experience, meaning that they had their core suite of creative products like Photoshop, Illustrators, for example, and they had an offering, especially in terms of digital marketing. But today, they are focusing much more on their customer groups. And I think that this is a very good way to approach the core business of Adobe today. And I think this is what we're going to do. Let's have a look at their latest basically financial and their latest updates in terms of financials, because this is why we are interested with Adobe stock. So we can see that they have still a good momentum. I think that Adobe has always been a stock which has been highly praised by the market because they have very strong free cash flow and recurring revenues. And that's why that with very low capex, very high margin and recurring revenue, it has always been a darling of Wall Street. But very recently, there is this narrative that they're going to lose in terms of AI, and that's why like the stock actually took actually a huge dive in 2025, and a lot of people actually are keeping this narrative that Adobe is going to be replaced by tools or Gen AI tools like Nano Banana, for example, or even tools from Canva or Figma, for example. So, but what we are seeing actually in the figures is that very similarly to Google, so Adobe is still growing revenue, double digit even. So like the latest revenue growth is around plus 10%. They also reaffirmed their guidance in their latest investor presentation. And I think that they are still actually on a very good trajectory today to continue to grow their business. If we look at their latest Q3 2025 earnings that they presented in September, actually they are going to report very soon in December their Q4 2025. But still, so what we are seeing is that they are still growing 11% in their latest reported figures, which is actually pretty good. And they have a GAAP EPS of around $4 today and non-GAAP EPS at around $5.31. Given that the stock price today is at 346, well, on an annualized basis, it's around obviously $20. So what we are seeing from the performance of Adobe is that Adobe is still growing revenue. And we are seeing that on both their digital media and digital experience side. So actually, the business of Adobe doesn't show a huge decline from Gen AI tools, but obviously, like the growth has declined from the previous years. And so in terms of financial highlights for their fiscal year 2025, so Adobe is presenting us actually very good figures, as we are seeing that they have like 700 million monthly active users across Acrobat and Express, so basically, which is their core suite for consumers, and growing plus 25% year on year. Their Firefly app, so which is the Gen AI app, has also monthly active users growing 30% quarter over quarter, so explosive growth for the Gen AI app, even though that a lot of people are thinking that Adobe is actually an AI loser. Then we have the launch of Creative Cloud Pro. Their apps subscription revenue is actually growing plus 40% year on year, which is actually quite good. And their key component of Gen Studio ARR is actually surpassing $1 billion today, growing plus 25% year on year. There are one Adobe deals, which is basically regrouping all their different core application of Adobe, growing plus 60%. And everything which is related to AI, so what they call AI influence ARR, surpassed $5 billion in the Q3 2025, which is actually up from 3.5 billion at the end of fiscal 24. So what we are seeing from that also is that, and we really take that, is that Adobe is actually showing very good growth in their new business related to AI. This is what they are highlighting. Obviously, because they're growing only 10% overall, so their legacy business, if we can say, is actually growing much lower. But definitely, what we are not seeing is that a company which is actually being displaced by AI, because they are also benefiting tremendously from the new Gen AI tools and the new Gen AI models. And now, speaking of AI, so actually in their latest investor presentation, Investor Day, so Adobe had a chance to present us what is their AI strategy. So what we are seeing is that they are going to position themselves as the application on top of all the different agents and all the different models, and obviously on top of the data. So what we are seeing that they are partnering with all the companies like Google, OpenAI, for example, to actually leverage their model and actually include them in Adobe application. And I think that this is actually a great way to actually attack the problem, especially for Adobe. We will come back to that, but they have two core segments. As we said previously, they have the amateur segment, so basically the consumer, which is going to actually compete with a very different type of businesses. And they have their pro segment, so basically people who are using Adobe application for their main job. Adobe is actually trying to actually be the application layer on top of all the Gen AI and on top of all the agent orchestration that is happening at a different type of company. So basically, I don't think that Adobe wants to compete with Google. I don't think that Adobe wants to compete with OpenAI, even though that they are building the model. So basically, the image model. And so I think that Adobe is going to actually benefit tremendously from all the work which is being done either on closed source or on open source for all these image and video models, even audio if we go. If Adobe can be like a perplexity in terms of creative models, I think that they're going to be a huge winner actually of AI and not actually the loser that the market is trying to sell us. We have seen that Adobe is growing double-digit revenue, so which is actually quite great. But now let's take a look at what's the future for Adobe and how we should actually see Adobe start going forward. So as we say, there are two core customer groups that they're addressing. We have the amateur or like semi-professionals, people who are using Adobe products on the side, and you have like professionals, so creative and marketing professionals. I think that these two are two different cohorts because first, they have a very different price sensitivity and they have very different needs. So let's start with actually the professional, because I think that this is first their core customer group for Adobe. And I think that this is where they are definitely going to win with AI. Why? Because Adobe is going to be, as we say, the application layer on top of all the different models, and they're going to be some kind of perplexity for creation with Gen AI, sorry. And so basically, definitely, so what we are going to see is that Adobe is going to create products that are going to simplify and make creation much more efficient for professionals. So actually, a lot of people are going to continue to use their favorite Adobe products. They're going to continue to use Firefly. And one thing that people should not forget is that one key important mode in AI is basically the IP, because well, we have seen a lot of different company actually be in a wild west where everybody is using IP without any concern on training the models. But I think that this is going to catch up to companies like Anthropic or OpenAI and even Google. So you cannot train your models on other people's IP. And also, like, if you want to custom the model, I think that a lot of people will have to use specific IP to train and custom train the model. So which means that if, for example, if you want to have a model to do something like Ghibli, for example, I think that in the future you will have to pay Ghibli and you will have to pay someone like Adobe to enable you to get access to the IP or even to your own IP and fine tune the models. And I think that this is where Adobe is going to shine, because this is going to become very complicated also to prove that you have used a model which is going to use licensed IP. And I think that for professional is going to be very important. I think that for amateur people, they don't really care. Like if you generate some kind of copyrighted stuff out of Nano Banana, like just for fun, I think it's okay. But like if you are doing if it's your job and you can be sued because you use, like, for example, OpenAI to generate some kind of fake Ghibli, and we have seen this lawsuit from Disney actually. So this is going to be very difficult. So I think that Adobe will have a very strong actually position if they can provide professionals with a very safe way to use licensed IP and generate content from that. On top of that, they've just released so with Firefly, the fine tuning and the custom or the customization of models with big companies' IP. What does it mean? It means that today, so if a big company wants to generate content with their own IP, I think it's a bit difficult because you have to train the model by yourself. And today, I think that Adobe is going to empower a lot of different professionals to be able to do that. So to bring your own IP and to bring your own assets and generate content. And I think that why is very important is because my takeaway from what I'm seeing actually in the space and development of AI is that we are going to need much more content going forward. I think that the end goal of all of that is that you will have content to be created on the fly every time you are doing digital marketing, meaning that content is going to be personalized. I think the era where content is actually created once and distributed to everyone, I think is kind of over. Content is going to be created by models in a very dynamic way, and I think also that we are going to see like content being generated, for example, in videos like this one, for example. And so that's why I think that Adobe is going to actually um, still be actually a very important tool for creators because this is going to bring a lot of complexity, and definitely like the cookie cut tool like OpenAI and Google, so with their own application, are not going to be enough for these professionals. I think that there are a lot of complexity that people they don't really realize that professionals need to actually take care of, and that's why I think that they are still going to rely very heavily on products like Adobe. And some could even argue that they are willing to, or they are going to be willing to pay even more Adobe because, like, all the generation of content is going to be so much cheaper than that that actually the money is going to come back to Adobe, meaning that people are going to be willing to pay more to have the tools to actually generate content more efficiently. So that's why I think that on the pro market, Adobe is still going to be a very strong winner, and I don't think that the market is realizing that at the moment. Now let's discuss the consumer side, and I think that this is where the battleground is, and this is where actually most people are focusing today on Adobe Store. And actually, I think that both Bull and Bears have a point here in terms of consumers, because I definitely think that the place of Adobe for consumer and semi-professional is going to be very difficult because it's going to be a much more competitive segment. If they go actually first towards their competitors like CapCut, Canvas, which is actually much cheaper. But we are seeing actually CapCut and Canvas actually have their own subscription model and actually rising prices. So I think that Adobe will have to adapt a little bit to actually become much more accessible and much more fun. I think that for a lot of different creators. And so this will be actually a very competitive space, but it will be much more difficult than on the professional side to actually continue to keep their market share or even grow their market share and grow their revenue. But still, I think that Adobe could do it. It's just not as obvious, I think, that on the professional side. So that's why I think that Wall Street is actually right to actually make the narrative and the argument that Adobe could be displaced by AI, because on the consumer side, this is a very real possibility. Because today we have discussed about their competitors with CapCut or Canva, for example, but they are also in competition with OpenAI and Google, for example, or even other tools or like other startups which provide actually access very easily to all the different models that have been developed by the frontier labs. And so I think that's why this is something that we have to actually wait and see on Adobe to see how they're going to navigate all this disruption on the consumer side. still today, I think that they still have a strong position, but they don't have actually a killer app or a killer feature to actually keep their position on the consumer side. So I think that's a real carve out, and this is something that we should actually care, because this will limit the growth going forward, definitely. And I don't think that's Adobe is going to have explosive growth going forward, because this is going to be very tough for them to actually tackle. But if they can do it, I think that the stock today is actually pretty great at the price and the valuation. And speaking of valuation, so let's look at the figures, and let's look at our favorite measures actually of if the stock is cheap or not. But let's look at closer to the valuation. So PE is at around 15 today. So we have a PEG ratio of around 1.7, which actually is cheap, but not actually fantastic. But I think that what we should actually look at is price to free cash flow and price to operating cash flow. So today the price to free cash flow is around 14, and we have the price to operating cash flow standing at 13.5. But what is very interesting is if we compare the valuation that we have today for Adobe compared to the valuation that they had in the past, given that this is a very strong cash flow business with recurring revenues and with very high margins. So historically, so their median or price operating cash flow on the next 12 months is around 25. So you can see definitely that we have a lot of upside if the stock is being re-rated by the market. So we have more than 50% upside given that. And so that's why I think that in terms of valuation today, the valuation is very compelling for Adobe. And if the market actually realize that Adobe is not going to be the AI loser that it think it is, we are going to see a pretty strong re-rating with the stock. So what I think is that the stock is actually or has actually a very high potential to actually do a plus 50% going forward, only based on only based on the re-rating of the stock in terms of valuation. I think that we can come back to price to operating cash flow to around 20, because I think that the business is not growing as fast as what it was today. But given that it is a very strong margin and very strong recurring cash flow business, I think that it deserves more than a 20 price to operating cash flow and price to free cash flow. So definitely, I think that the takeaway from all of this is that basically Adobe today is actually a very great company. The fact that they're going to be completely disrupted by AI, I think, is very misleading and actually very not right in a sense. Meaning that a lot of people are going to be surprised that they're going to be very resilient, especially given their professional business, which is going to benefit, I think, tremendously from AI actually and from Gen AI. On the consumer side, it's going to be much more difficult. That's why I think that we should be prudent with the growth of Adobe. But definitely, we are going to continue to see growth for Adobe going forward, and we are going to see a re-rating in the valuation of Adobe, because a lot of people are going to realize that the business is still strong. The business is still going to continue to grow, even though it's not going to be a high flyer as it was before, but it definitely deserves a very much higher multiple, especially on the different valuation metrics. And so I think that we're going to see a re-rating pretty soon. But this is not financial advice. I think that in my opinion, Adobe is actually quite compelling. Not the best opportunity in the market, but I think that it is actually a strong choice today. So if you're looking at the stock, and I think that if you buy Adobe today, you are going to do well in the next 3 to 5 years, definitely. And if you're interested in analysis like this one, please check my other videos, please subscribe, and I see you in another one. Bye.